I should have been dead. They made sure of that. My husband and my lawyer had calculated every detail, measured every dose, forged every document. But what they didn't count on was that the woman who cleaned their messes was watching every move. And when I collapsed on that cold marble bathroom floor with my vision fading and Marisol's scream echoing through my mansion, I had no idea that the person trying to kill me was sleeping in my bed every night. My name is Celestine Hartwell, and right now I'm lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to machines I don't recognize, trying to piece together how the empire I built from absolutely nothing almost became my tomb. The doctors keep using words like critical condition and organ failure, but they have no idea what's actually wrong with me. Or, at least, they didn't. Not yet. 6 months ago, my life looked completely different. I was standing in the boardroom of Hartwell Quantum Securities, my company, the one I'd grown from a single patent into a $2.3 billion quantum computing security empire. I remember that morning so clearly now. I was wearing my favorite charcoal suit, the one that made me feel invincible. My senior engineers were presenting our latest breakthrough in encrypted quantum networks, and I felt like I was on top of the world. Every government agency, every major corporation, every entity that needed their data protected from the next generation of cyber threats came to me.
To us.
To what I'd built. I built all of this from ashes. Literally. When I was 19 years old, my parents died in a factory fire. My father was a machinist, my mother worked the assembly line. We had nothing. They left me with $1,700 in a savings account, and a grief so heavy I could barely breathe. But my father had always told me that my mind was the one thing no one could ever take from me. So I worked 3 jobs, put myself through MIT, and turned a graduate thesis on quantum encryption into the foundation of an empire. Every brick of my company headquarters was built on sleepless nights and relentless determination. And 15 years ago, when I was just starting to see real success, I met Dashiell. God, he was magnetic. 10 years older than me. Sophisticated, charming in that effortless way that made everyone in the room lean in when he spoke. He was a venture capitalist back then, and he believed in my vision when so many others called it impossible. He mentored me through my first major funding round, taught me how to navigate boardrooms full of men who thought a young woman had no business talking about quantum mechanics. I fell in love with him because he saw me. Or at least I thought he did. We got married in a small ceremony in Napa Valley. Just us, a handful of friends, and endless promises about building a future together. For years, it felt real. He'd bring me coffee when I worked late in my home office. He'd celebrate every company milestone like it was his own victory. He'd hold me on the nights when imposter syndrome threatened to swallow me whole and remind me that I'd earned everything I had. And then there was Thorne Ashford, my attorney and one of my closest friends. I met him around the same time I met Dashiell, actually. Thorne handled all my legal affairs, from patent protections to contract negotiations. He was brilliant, meticulous, the kind of lawyer who made opposing counsel nervous just by walking into a room. His reputation in legal circles was flawless. I trusted him with every aspect of my estate planning, my business succession plans, my entire financial infrastructure. He knew where every asset was buried, every offshore account, every stock option. He was family. These 2 men, my husband and my lawyer, were the pillars of my personal life while I conquered the professional world. I had no idea they'd become the architects of my destruction. It started 3 months ago, though I didn't recognize it as a beginning. I just thought I was tired. We were in the middle of acquiring a competing firm, a $50 million deal that required 14-hour days and endless negotiations. I started feeling nauseous in the mornings. Fatigue that no amount of sleep could fix. Brain fog that made me lose my train of thought in the middle of important meetings. I'd forget names of people I'd known for years. I'd walk into a room and have no idea why I was there. I told myself it was stress. I was pushing too hard. I needed to slow down. And Dashiell, my devoted husband, seemed so concerned. He'd insist I rest more, take breaks, let him handle some of the smaller decisions. He started making my evening tea every night, this special chamomile blend he said would help me sleep better. He'd bring it to me in my office, in our bedroom, wherever I was working, and he'd watch me drink it with these caring eyes. He'd stroke my hair and tell me I was pushing myself too hard, that I needed to take care of myself, that the company would survive without me micromanaging every detail. I drank the tea every single night. Every single night. Thorne started coming by the house more frequently during this time. He'd want to discuss estate planning updates, revision to my will, adjustments to the succession structure. He kept saying it was just routine, just making sure everything was buttoned up properly given the company's growth. He'd suggest changes that seemed reasonable at the time. Shifting certain assets into different trusts. Updating beneficiary designations. Making sure Dashiell would have immediate access to funds if something happened to me. It all sounded so responsible, so mature. I signed documents without reading them as carefully as I should have. My hands would shake too much to focus anyway. And Marisol noticed everything. Marisol Delgado had been my housekeeper for 10 years. She came to me through an agency initially, but within weeks, she felt like family. She was in her late 50s, with silver streaks in her black hair and hands that had seen decades of hard work. She'd immigrated from Ecuador 20 years earlier, and she worked harder than anyone I'd ever met. She cleaned my home like it was her own, cooked meals that reminded me I needed to eat, and moved through the house with this quiet observation that I'd always appreciated. She never gossiped, never overstepped, but she saw everything. She noticed that Dashiell always prepared my evening tea himself. Even when she offered to make it, he'd insist with his tight smile that he wanted to do it for me. She noticed how he'd hover until I finished drinking it. She noticed how Thorne and Dashiell would disappear into my study for these intense, whispered conversations that would stop abruptly the moment anyone approached. One evening about 2 months ago, Marisol was polishing the credenza outside my study when she heard them. Dashiell and Thorne, their voices low and tense. She couldn't make out full sentences, but she caught fragments. Dashiell saying something about timelines and patience wearing thin. Thorne responding with words like estate and control and soon. Marisol told me later that the hair on the back of her neck stood up. She'd lost her own daughter to domestic violence years before, and she'd learned to recognize when something was deeply wrong beneath the surface of normalcy. But she was just the housekeeper. An immigrant woman who cleaned toilets and folded laundry. Who would believe her suspicions about a powerful venture capitalist and a respected attorney? She kept watching. She kept noticing. And she stayed silent because she was afraid. Afraid of losing her job. Afraid of deportation. Afraid that speaking up would make everything worse. Meanwhile, my symptoms escalated from concerning to terrifying. The nausea became violent vomiting. The fatigue turned into days where I could barely get out of bed. My hands developed tremors that made it impossible to type on my laptop. I'd have memory lapses where entire meetings would vanish from my mind. My hair started falling out in clumps in the shower. I'd have shooting pains through my kidneys that would double me over. I lost 15 pounds in 3 weeks. Dashiell took me to see Dr. Lennox Chow, my physician of 7 years. Lennox was this brilliant toxicologist who'd done his residency at Johns Hopkins and specialized in complex diagnostic cases. I trusted him completely. He ran every test imaginable. Blood panels, MRIs, CT scans, genetic testing. Everything came back inconclusive. Some markers were elevated, some were suppressed, but nothing pointed to a clear diagnosis. He suggested it might be an autoimmune condition, possibly lupus or multiple sclerosis. He started me on steroids and immunosuppressants. I got worse. I started losing my grip on the company I'd built. I'd miss important board meetings because I was too sick to get dressed. I'd make decisions that my executive team would have to quietly reverse because they made no strategic sense. During a video call with our largest client, I forgot the name of our flagship product. Just completely blanked. The concerned looks on everyone's faces haunted me for days. The board started having quiet conversations about my capacity to lead. I wasn't supposed to know about these discussions, but word always gets back. They wondered if I needed to step down temporarily. If the stress of leadership was literally killing me. If the company's future was at risk with me at the helm. And Dashiell, my loving husband, reluctantly stepped up. With Thorne's legal guidance, he took temporary control of day-to-day operations. Just until I recovered, everyone said. Just until we figured out what was wrong. The board approved it because what choice did they have? I was disappearing before their eyes, and someone needed to keep the ship steady. If you're watching this and you've ever felt betrayed by someone you loved, let me know in the comments. Because what happened next showed me that the cruelest betrayals come from the people we trust most. Marisol was putting away Dashiell's laundry one afternoon when she found it. Tucked deep in the back of his sock drawer, hidden beneath layers of expensive wool and cashmere, was a small amber glass vial. No label. No prescription information. Just this innocuous little bottle that could have contained anything. She almost put it back and forgot about it. But something made her slip it into her apron pocket. Some instinct that had been screaming at her for weeks. That night, while I lay in bed too exhausted to move, while Dashiell sat in his office working on what he claimed were company reports, Marisol sat in her small room off the kitchen and stared at that vial. She thought about her daughter Sophia, who died at 32 because no one believed her when she said her boyfriend was dangerous. She thought about how silence had killed Sophia. And she decided that this time, she wouldn't stay quiet. But I didn't know any of this yet. I was just trying to survive each day. Trying to understand why my body was destroying itself. Trying to hold onto the company I'd built while it slipped through my trembling fingers. I was disappearing from my own life, and I didn't even realize I was being erased. The truth was hiding in a sock drawer, in whispered conversations, in a cup of chamomile tea that tasted like love but carried death. And the only person who saw it clearly was the woman everyone overlooked. The woman who cleaned up everyone else's messes but was about to expose the biggest mess of all. If this story is gripping you, hit that subscribe button right now because what happens next will blow your mind. Marisol's discovery is about to unravel a conspiracy that goes deeper than anyone imagined, and you don't want to miss a single moment of how this empire built on trust becomes a battlefield of betrayal. What Marisol did next saved my life, though I wouldn't know it for days. While I was lying in that hospital bed, barely conscious, slipping further away with each passing hour, she was waging a war I didn't even know existed. That amber vial she'd found in Dashiell's sock drawer haunted her. She told me later that she barely slept that night. She kept turning it over in her hands in her small room, this innocuous little bottle that somehow felt like it contained answers to questions she was afraid to ask. At 3 a.m, she made a decision. She took out her phone, the one with the cracked screen that she'd been meaning to replace for 2 years, and she photographed that vial from every angle. The amber glass. The lack of any label. The clear liquid inside that caught the light from her bedside lamp. Then she did something that required more courage than most people will ever need in their lifetime. She opened her laptop, the old one I'd given her when I upgraded mine, and she started researching. She typed in my symptoms. All of them. The nausea, the tremors, the hair loss, the memory problems, the kidney pain, the rapid weight loss. She spent hours going down medical rabbit holes, reading about toxins and poisons, and environmental hazards. And then she found it. Thallium sulfate. A heavy metal poison that was once commonly used in rat poison before it was banned in most countries because it was too deadly, too effective, too easy to use for murder. The symptoms matched mine perfectly. Every single one. The hair loss, the neurological problems, the gastrointestinal distress, the kidney damage. It was like reading my medical chart translated into the language of homicide. Marisol sat back in her chair, and she told me her hands were shaking so badly she could barely hold her phone. Because she knew. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that someone was poisoning me. And the person who'd had access to me every single day, who'd insisted on making my tea personally, who'd watched me drink it with those concerned eyes, was my husband. But knowing the truth and being able to prove it are two completely different things. Marisol was undocumented. She'd overstayed her visa by 8 years. She'd built a quiet life, stayed invisible, never caused problems, never drew attention. The idea of walking into a police station and accusing a wealthy, powerful venture capitalist and a respected attorney of attempted murder terrified her. Who would believe the housekeeper over them? And what if they retaliated by reporting her immigration status? She'd be deported before anyone took her seriously. She'd lose everything. She'd lose me. But then she thought about her daughter, Sophia. Beautiful Sophia with her bright laugh and her dreams of becoming a teacher. Sophia who'd called her mother one night, 13 years ago, whispering that her boyfriend was hurting her. And Marisol, working 3 jobs at the time, exhausted and overwhelmed, had told her daughter she was probably overreacting. That relationships were complicated. That she should try to work it out. 3 weeks later, Sophia was dead. Her boyfriend had beaten her so severely that she died of internal bleeding in their apartment while he was passed out drunk on their couch. Marisol had lived with that guilt every single day since. The guilt of not believing her daughter when it mattered most. The guilt of choosing doubt over action. She'd sworn at Sophia's grave that she would never ignore warning signs again. That she would never let fear silence her when someone's life was at stake. So she decided that even if it cost her everything, she would save me. Because I'd given her a home when she had nothing. I'd treated her like family when the rest of the world treated her like she was invisible. I'd helped her bring her granddaughter to the United States, paid for the immigration lawyers, made sure the child had everything she needed. I'd celebrated her birthday every year, learned to make her favorite Ecuadorian dishes so she wouldn't feel so homesick, sat with her in the kitchen on the anniversary of Sophia's death, and just held her hand while she cried. She loved me. And love, Marisol decided, was stronger than fear. She started documenting everything. She bought a small notebook from the drugstore and began recording times, dates, patterns. Every evening at 8:30, Dashiell would prepare my tea in the kitchen. He'd boil the water in the electric kettle, use the chamomile blend from the blue tin in the cupboard, and he'd steep it for exactly 4 minutes. But then Marisol noticed he'd take the cup into the pantry. Always the pantry. He'd be in there for maybe 30 seconds, never longer. And when he emerged, he'd bring me the tea with that caring smile. Marisol started watching the pantry. One afternoon, when Dashiell was out and I was sleeping upstairs, she searched it thoroughly. Behind the organic pasta and the imported olive oil, hidden behind a box of rice we never used, she found another small amber vial. This one was nearly empty. Just a few drops of clear liquid at the bottom. She photographed it, documented its location, and left it exactly where she found it. Evidence. She was building a case even though she had no idea what she'd do with it. Then one night, everything accelerated. I was in the hospital by this point. I'd collapsed in the bathroom 3 days earlier, and the doctors had admitted me for observation and more testing. Dashiell was at the house, and Marisol had stayed late to prepare some meals he could freeze. It was nearly midnight, and she was about to leave when she heard his voice coming from my study. He was on the phone, and he was angry. Marisol froze in the hallway, her heart pounding. She pulled out her phone and, with trembling hands, started recording. Dashiell's voice was sharp, impatient. He said the board was getting restless, that I wasn't dying fast enough, that if this dragged on much longer, people would start asking more questions. Marisol pressed herself against the wall, barely breathing, trying to keep her phone steady. Then she heard Thorne's voice. He must have been on speaker. Thorne, always so smooth and controlled, said that one more dose should finish it. That he'd already prepared all the transfer documents. Everything was ready. They just needed me gone. Marisol told me later that the room started spinning when she heard this. These weren't suspicions anymore. This wasn't paranoia or misunderstood fragments. This was a confession. A conspiracy. A murder plot laid out in casual business terms like they were discussing a merger. Dashiell asked about the cause of death. How would they explain it? Thorne's response was clinical, detached. They'd frame it as kidney failure, a tragic result of an undiagnosed autoimmune condition. Dr. Chow had already documented inconclusive test results, so it would seem like a medical mystery that simply couldn't be solved in time. Natural causes. Unfortunate, but not suspicious. Then they discussed the business succession. Thorne had forged documents, he said. Signatures, board resolutions, trust modifications. Everything that would give him and Dashiell joint control of Hartwell Quantum Securities upon my death. They'd split it 60-40, with Dashiell taking the larger share as the grieving widower who'd stepped up during his wife's tragic illness. Within a year, they'd sell the company to one of our competitors who'd been trying to acquire us for 18 months. They'd walk away with over $1 billion each. They talked about my death like it was a stock transaction. Like I was just an obstacle to be removed, a problem to be solved. 15 years of marriage, and Dashiell discussed ending my life with less emotion than he'd used to discuss selling a car. Marisol's phone captured every word. Her hands were shaking so badly that the audio was shaky, but every syllable was clear. When Dashiell finally ended the call, Marisol ran. She slipped out the back door, got into her old Honda with the broken air conditioning, and she drove. She didn't know where she was going at first. She just drove through the dark streets of our neighborhood, her mind racing, trying to figure out what to do with the proof she now carried. She thought about going to the police. But would they believe a recording from a housekeeper? Could they get a warrant fast enough? What if Dashiell and Thorne had connections in law enforcement? Rich men always had connections. And there was still her immigration status hanging over her like a sword. No, she decided. She needed to go to someone who already knew me, who already had pieces of the puzzle, who might be able to act quickly enough to save my life. She needed to go to Dr. Lennox Chow. The next morning, she showed up at his office without an appointment. The receptionist tried to turn her away. Dr. Chow was fully booked. He couldn't see walk-ins. Marisol planted herself in a chair in the waiting room and refused to move. She told a receptionist that she had information about Celestine Hartwell's condition, and she would wait all day if necessary. 2 hours later, between patients, Dr. Chow finally agreed to give her 5 minutes. He was clearly irritated. He had that expression medical professionals get when they think they're about to deal with someone who's watched too many episodes of medical dramas and decided they know better than the doctors. He probably thought Marisol was going to suggest some herbal remedy or tell him he'd missed something obvious. Marisol walked into his office, set the amber vial on his desk, and said 3 words that changed everything. She said, "She's being poisoned." Dr. Chow looked at the vial, then at Marisol, and she could see him preparing to dismiss her gently. He started to say something about how sometimes families get concerned and start seeing conspiracies when really it's just a complicated medical situation that hasn't been diagnosed yet. That's when Marisol pulled out her phone and played the recording. Dashiell's voice filled the office. "She's not dying fast enough." Thorne's response. "One more dose should do it." The casual discussion of forged documents and framed causes of death and billion-dollar payoffs. Dr. Chow's expression transformed. The irritation vanished, replaced by shock, then horror, then a cold, focused intensity. He picked up the vial, held it up to the light, and Marisol could see his mind working through possibilities. He asked her where she'd found it. She told him everything. The sock drawer, the pantry, Dashiell's nightly tea ritual, my symptoms that matched thallium poisoning perfectly. Dr. Chow didn't waste time. He called his lab immediately, told them he was bringing in a priority sample that needed to be tested for heavy metals, specifically thallium. He asked Marisol if there was any way to get a sample of the tea. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thermos. That morning, she explained, Dashiell had prepared a cup before leaving for the hospital to visit me. He'd left it on the counter to cool. Marisol had poured it into this thermos and brought it with her. This woman, this housekeeper that everyone overlooked, had just handed a toxicologist everything he needed to prove attempted murder. The tests took 4 hours. Dr. Chow tested the liquid from the vial first. Pure thallium sulfate solution. Highly concentrated. Lethal in small doses over time. Then he tested the tea. The concentration of thallium was staggering. 1 cup contained enough to seriously damage major organs. Months of drinking this tea, a little bit of poison delivered with kisses and concerned words, had been slowly destroying me from the inside out. But Dr. Chow needed one more piece of confirmation. He pulled my stored blood samples, the ones from all those inconclusive tests over the past months, and he ran them specifically for heavy metal poisoning. Standard toxicology panels don't always catch thallium unless you're specifically looking for it. It's not something that comes up in routine blood work. The results came back, and Dr. Chow told me later that he felt physically sick when he saw them. My blood showed chronic thallium poisoning spanning at least 6 months, probably longer. The levels had been building progressively, each dose adding to the accumulated poison in my system. My kidneys were failing because they'd been trying to filter out a toxin that they weren't equipped to handle. My nervous system was deteriorating under the assault of heavy metal damage. My hair was falling out because thallium disrupts the growth cycle of hair follicles. I was being murdered in slow motion, and every doctor who'd examined me had missed it because we'd been looking for diseases when we should have been looking for weapons. Dr. Chow made several phone calls in rapid succession. First, to the hospital where I was currently admitted. He ordered an immediate transfer to the secure ICU. No visitors except approved medical staff. Security posted outside my room. He began chelation therapy, a treatment that would help bind the thallium in my system and allow my body to excrete it before it could do more damage. Then he called the police, specifically a detective he knew in the Major Crimes Division. And then he did something that probably saved my life in more ways than one. He called Marisol back into his office, and he thanked her. He told her that what she'd done took extraordinary courage and that she'd saved a life today. He told her that he would make sure the police understood that she was a witness, not a suspect. That he would personally advocate for her protection. That she didn't need to be afraid. Marisol cried in his office. She told him about Sophia, about the guilt she'd carried for 13 years, about how she'd failed her daughter but refused to fail me. Dr. Chow listened, and then he told her something she'd never forget. He said that Sophia would be proud of her. That what she'd done today honored her daughter's memory in the most powerful way possible. While all of this was happening, while Marisol was fighting a war to save my life, I was slipping further away. The nurses in the ICU told me later that there was a 12-hour period where they weren't sure I'd make it. My kidney function was critical. My neurological responses were deteriorating. The accumulated poison had brought me to the edge of organ failure. But the chelation therapy started working. Slowly, incrementally, my body began to stabilize. The thallium levels in my blood started to drop. My kidneys, damaged but resilient, began to recover. My mind started to clear from the fog that had consumed it for months. I woke up 3 days later in the ICU, and I had no idea where I was or why. The last clear memory I had was collapsing in my bathroom. Everything after that was fragments and confusion. Dr. Chow was there when I opened my eyes. So was Marisol. She was sitting in a chair by the window, and when she saw me wake up, she started crying. They told me everything. Every detail of the conspiracy, the poisoning, the forged documents, the murder plot. They played me the recording of Dashiell and Thorne discussing my death like a business arrangement. They showed me the vials, the test results, the evidence that had been hiding in plain sight while I'd trusted the 2 men who were killing me. I listened to my husband's voice on that recording, and something inside me shattered. 15 years of marriage. 15 years of shared dreams and intimate moments and whispered promises. All of it was a lie. He'd never loved me. He'd loved what I represented. The wealth, the status, the power. And when living in my shadow became unbearable, when his gambling debts and failed investments left him desperate, he decided that I was worth more dead than alive. And Thorne, my friend, my trusted advisor, the man who'd guided me through every major legal decision of my adult life. He'd been embezzling from me for years, it turned out. Siphoning money from accounts he managed, falsifying reports, covering his tracks with the expertise of someone who knew exactly how I'd audit my finances. He was hundreds of thousands of dollars deep in theft when he and Dashiell had apparently realized they could solve both their problems with one solution. Get rid of me, take over the company, sell it for billions. I lay in that hospital bed, and I felt emotions I didn't know I was capable of feeling. Betrayal so deep it felt like my chest was caving in. Rage so hot it made my hands shake all over again, but this time not from poison. Grief for the marriage I'd thought I had, for the friendship I'd believed was real. And underneath all of it, a cold, crystallizing determination. They'd tried to erase me. They'd tried to make me disappear from my own life, my own company, my own existence. They'd calculated that I was trusting enough, loving enough, naive enough to drink poison from their hands and never question it. They were right about the trust. They were wrong about everything else. I asked Dr. Chow how long I had before Dashiell, and Thorne realized I wasn't dying on schedule. He estimated maybe 48 hours before they'd start to panic. They'd expect my organs to fail completely any day now. When I started recovering instead, they'd know something had gone wrong. That gave me 2 days to get strong enough to fight back. 2 days to plan the destruction of the men who'd tried to destroy me. 2 days to transform from victim to victor. I looked at Marisol, sitting by my bedside, this woman who'd risked everything to save me. This woman who everyone overlooked, who cleaned up messes and folded laundry and moved through the world quietly. She'd been the only one brave enough to see the truth and act on it. While I was disappearing from my own life, Marisol was fighting a war I didn't even know was happening. I reached for her hand, and I made her a promise. I told her that when this was over, when Dashiell and Thorne were behind bars where they belonged, I would make sure she never had to worry about immigration status or job security or being invisible ever again. She'd saved my life. I was going to change hers. But first, I had to reclaim my empire. And I had exactly the plan to do it. Have you ever had someone fight for you when you couldn't fight for yourself? Drop a comment and let me know, because what happens next is the kind of justice that most people only dream about. Marisol's courage set the stage, but the final act was about to prove that you don't build a billion-dollar empire by being weak. You build it by being smart enough to know when to strike. And I was about to strike with everything I had. Make sure you're subscribed because the confrontation that's coming will leave you speechless. The chelation therapy felt like fire in my veins, but it was the kind of fire that purifies rather than destroys. For the first 48 hours, I drifted in and out of consciousness, while the treatment worked to bind the thallium poisoning my system and flush it out of my body. Dr. Chow monitored me constantly, adjusting dosages, running tests every few hours to track my progress. Marisol never left my side. She slept in the chair by my window, and every time I opened my eyes, she was there. On the third day, something shifted. The fog that had been smothering my mind for months started to lift. It was like watching a sunrise after living in darkness for so long. Thoughts that had been slippery and elusive suddenly crystallized. Memories that had been fragmented started piecing themselves back together. And with that clarity came a reckoning with everything I'd lost and everything that had been stolen from me. Dr. Chow and Marisol sat with me for hours, walking me through every detail of the conspiracy they'd uncovered. The timeline of my poisoning. The forged documents Thorne had prepared. The business succession plan that would have handed my empire to my murderers. The recording of Dashiell and Thorne discussing my death with the casual indifference of men ordering lunch. But it was the small details that destroyed me. Marisol told me how Dashiell had prepared my tea every single night with such careful attention, how he'd disappear into the pantry for those crucial 30 seconds where he added the poison, how he'd watch me drink it with eyes that I'd interpreted as love, but were actually calculation. She told me about the vial hidden in his sock drawer, tucked between the expensive cashmere I'd bought him for our anniversary. She told me how Thorne had been embezzling from me for 3 years, how he'd used his position as my attorney to hide his theft behind layers of legal complexity I'd trusted him to manage. Every loving memory I had started recontextualizing itself in real time. That time Dashiell brought me soup when I was sick last year, insisting I drink every drop. Had that been poison too? Was he testing dosages even then? Our anniversary dinner 6 months ago, where he'd been so attentive, so romantic, ordering my favorite wine and toasting to our future together. Had he already decided by then that I didn't have a future? That he was going to erase me and take everything I'd built? I remembered Thorne at my father's funeral 25 years ago, when I was just a grieving teenager with nothing to my name. He'd helped me navigate my parents' minimal estate, had refused to charge me his standard fees because he said he believed in me. I'd thought that was kindness. I'd thought that was friendship. Now I understood it was an investment. He'd seen potential in me, and he'd positioned himself to extract maximum value when the time came. Every hug, every reassurance, Every moment of support had been a transaction. They'd both been playing a long game, and I'd been too trusting, too grateful for their presence in my life, to see that I was never a person to them. I was an asset. And when assets become more valuable liquidated than maintained, you liquidate them. The grief was overwhelming. I lay in that hospital bed and mourned my marriage, my friendship, my innocence, my trust. I mourned the version of myself who'd believed that love meant something, that loyalty was real, that the people closest to you wanted the best for you. That woman was gone. She died on that bathroom floor, poisoned by the hands that had promised to cherish her. But something else was rising from those ashes. Something cold and sharp and absolutely unbreakable.
Rage.
Pure, focused, transformative rage. They'd tried to kill me. They'd tried to steal my company, my life's work, everything I'd built from the wreckage of my parents' death. They'd calculated that I'd be easy to erase because I was trusting and loving and naive enough to drink poison served with a smile. They'd made a critical miscalculation. I hadn't built a $2.3 billion empire by being weak. I'd built it by being relentless, by refusing to accept defeat, by fighting for every single breakthrough, every patent, every contract, every impossible goal that everyone said I'd never achieve. I'd survived poverty, grief, sexism, and every obstacle the business world had thrown at me. I'd survived because I was stronger than anyone gave me credit for. And now I was going to show Dashiell and Thorn exactly how strong I could be. On my 4th day in the ICU, when my kidney function had stabilized and my neurological responses had improved enough that Dr. Chow felt confident I'd make a full recovery, I made a phone call. I called my executive assistant, Patricia, who'd been with me since the early days of the company. I told her I needed an emergency board meeting scheduled for the following week. I told her it was urgent, that it concerned my health and the future of the company, and that every board member needed to be there in person. No exceptions. No virtual attendance. Patricia's voice was careful, concerned. She asked if I was okay, if there was anything she could do. I told her I was handling a situation and that I'd explain everything soon. I told her to make sure Dashiell and Thorn were both notified and both confirmed their attendance. She promised she would. The moment I ended that call, I knew the countdown had started. Dashiell and Thorn would hear about the board meeting, and they'd assume I was about to resign. They'd think my health had deteriorated to the point where I had no choice but to step down permanently. They'd probably already prepared speeches about how much they'd learned from me, how they'd honor my legacy, how they'd guide the company through this difficult transition. They'd show up expecting my surrender. They had no idea they were walking into an execution. But I couldn't just spring this on the board. I couldn't just announce that my husband and attorney had been trying to murder me without bulletproof evidence and institutional support. I needed the full weight of the federal government behind me. I needed this to be airtight, inescapable, undeniable. So I made another call. This one to a contact I'd developed years ago during a government contract negotiation. Special Agent Vivian Cross with the FBI's Corporate Fraud Division. She'd been impressive then, sharp and thorough, and she'd told me if I ever encountered anything that crossed from corporate malfeasance into criminal territory, I should reach out. I never imagined I'd need to make that call about my own husband and lawyer. I told her everything. The poisoning, the embezzlement, the forged documents, the conspiracy to commit murder and fraud. I told her I had evidence, medical records, toxicology reports, recordings, witness testimony. I told her I was calling an emergency board meeting where the conspirators would likely present fraudulent documents to try to seize control of my company, and that I wanted federal agents present to make arrests. Agent Cross listened without interrupting. When I finished, there was a long pause. Then she said that attempted murder combined with corporate fraud and embezzlement at this scale was absolutely within FBI jurisdiction, especially given that my company held multiple federal security contracts. She said she'd need to review all the evidence immediately, that she'd coordinate with local law enforcement and the district attorney's office, and that if everything I'd said checked out, she'd have agents positioned for the board meeting. She warned me that what I was planning was risky, that Dashiell and Thorn might panic if they sensed anything was wrong, that desperate people do desperate things. I told her I understood the risks. I told her I'd already survived their attempt to kill me, and I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I was done being their victim. I was ready to be their reckoning. Over the next 3 days, while I continued recovering in the hospital, Agent Cross and her team built their case. They reviewed Dr. Chow's medical evidence, listened to Marisol's recording dozens of times, traced the purchase of the thallium sulfate through a complex web of online vendors and shell companies that eventually led back to an account Dashiell had opened 2 years ago. They subpoenaed Thorne's law firm records and found the embezzlement, the forged signatures, the fraudulent trust modifications. They built a case so comprehensive that a conviction was virtually guaranteed. And through it all, Dashiell and Thorne had no idea the walls were closing in. They visited me in the hospital, playing their roles perfectly. Dashiell would sit by my bed holding my hand, his face arranged in an expression of worry and devotion. He'd ask the doctors about my prognosis, making sure his voice carried just the right note of desperate hope. He'd stroke my hair and tell me to fight, that I had so much to live for, that he couldn't imagine his life without me. I let him perform. I even squeezed his hand back and told him I loved him because I needed him to believe he was still winning. I needed him confident and unsuspecting when he walked into that boardroom. Thorne was equally convincing. He'd show up with legal documents for me to review, talking about estate management and business continuity plans. He'd use his smooth attorney voice to explain complex provisions, telling me it was all just standard preparation, nothing to worry about. He'd emphasize how he'd take care of everything if I became unable to manage my affairs. How he'd make sure my wishes were honored, my legacy protected. Every word was a lie wrapped in concern. And I smiled and nodded and signed nothing, telling him I wanted to wait until after the board meeting to make any final decisions. He agreed readily, probably thinking he'd have everything he needed soon enough anyway. The day of the board meeting arrived. I was still weak, still recovering, but I'd insisted on being discharged from the hospital. Dr. Chow had arranged for a wheelchair and a private nurse to accompany me, and he'd agreed to attend the meeting himself to present the medical evidence when the time came. Marisol had pressed one of her good dresses and stood in front of the mirror practicing what she'd say when called upon. Agent Cross had positioned FBI agents in unmarked vehicles outside the building and 2 more in security uniforms inside the lobby. Everything was set. The trap was laid. All that remained was springing it. I arrived at Hartwell Quantum Security's headquarters in that wheelchair, looking frail and diminished. It was partially strategic and partially reality. I was stronger than I'd been a week ago, but the months of poisoning had taken their toll. My hair was thin from the thallium exposure. My skin had a grayish pallor. I'd lost so much weight that my clothes hung loose on my frame. I looked like someone who was dying, which was exactly what Dashiell and Thorne expected to see. The boardroom was on the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city I'd conquered with innovation and determination. 12 board members were already seated around the long mahogany table when I was wheeled in. They all stood, concern etched on their faces. Several rushed over to express their worry, to tell me I should be resting, to ask if I was really well enough for this meeting. I assured them I was fine, that this was important, that I needed them all to hear what I had to say. I positioned my wheelchair at the head of the table, in my usual seat, and gestured for everyone to sit. Dashiell sat to my right, playing the devoted husband. He'd dressed impeccably in a navy suit I'd bought him, and he kept one hand on my shoulder in a gesture that probably looked supportive to everyone else, but made my skin crawl. Thorne sat 3 seats down, his briefcase open in front of him, documents arranged in neat stacks. He caught my eye and gave me a small, encouraging nod. I wanted to scream at both of them. I wanted to lunge across that table and claw their eyes out. But I'd learned something crucial over the past week. Rage is most effective when it's cold, calculated, and perfectly timed. So I smiled weakly and thanked everyone for coming. Then I yielded the floor to Dashiell, telling him I wasn't quite strong enough to lead the meeting myself, asking if he'd be willing to start the discussion. He agreed with practiced reluctance, standing and buttoning his jacket with the confidence of a man who thought he'd already won. Dashiell gave a performance worthy of an Oscar. He talked about my deteriorating health, about the mysterious condition that doctors hadn't been able to diagnose or treat effectively. He spoke about how much it pained him to watch me suffer, how he'd been by my side through every difficult moment. He emphasized how proud he was of everything I'd built, how Hartwell Quantum Securities was my legacy and deserved to be protected. Then he introduced what he called a difficult but necessary conversation. He said that given my declining health and uncertain prognosis, the board needed to consider succession planning, that the company needed stable leadership, that shareholders and clients needed assurance that operations would continue seamlessly regardless of what happened to me. Thorne stood next, pulling documents from his briefcase. He explained that he'd been working with me over the past months to put together a comprehensive succession plan. He distributed copies to each board member, legal documents with my signature on them, provisions that would transfer controlling interest to a trust managed jointly by Dashiell and himself in the event of my incapacity or death. He walked through each provision with his usual meticulous attention to detail, making it all sound reasonable and responsible and exactly what any prudent CEO would do. The board members read through the documents, asking questions, nodding along. A few glanced at me with sympathy, probably thinking how tragic it was that I deteriorated to the point of needing this kind of planning. No one questioned the authenticity of my signatures. Why would they? Thorne was my attorney. Dashiell was my husband. These were the two people everyone assumed I trusted most in the world. I let them finish their entire presentation. Every word, every falsified document, every manipulation. I wanted the board to hear it all. I wanted the full scope of their conspiracy laid out clearly before I demolished it. When Thorne finally sat down, there was a moment of heavy silence. Several board members looked at me expectantly, probably waiting for me to formally resign, or confirm the succession plan, or break down crying. Instead, I straightened in my wheelchair and smiled. Not a weak smile. Not a sad smile. A smile with teeth. I said I wanted to thank two people before I made my decision about the company's future. That two individuals had shown me what true loyalty and courage looked like over the past weeks. That their actions had literally saved my life and saved this company from being stolen by criminals. You could have heard a pin drop in that boardroom. Dashiell's hand tightened on my shoulder. Thorne's eyes narrowed slightly. They knew something was wrong, but they couldn't figure out what. They couldn't stop what was coming. I asked Dr. Chow to come in. He entered carrying a tablet and a folder thick with medical records. He introduced himself to the board, established his credentials as my physician and a recognized expert in toxicology, and then he dropped the bomb. He explained that I hadn't been suffering from an autoimmune disease or any natural illness. I'd been suffering from chronic heavy metal poisoning. Specifically, thallium sulfate poisoning administered over a period of at least 6 months. He showed the board my test results, the toxicology reports, the evidence of systematic poisoning. He explained that thallium is a known murder weapon, that it's been used in assassination attempts throughout history because it mimics natural disease and is difficult to detect unless you're specifically looking for it. He explained that without intervention, I would have died within days, and my death would have been attributed to kidney failure and neurological deterioration. Natural causes. The board erupted. Questions flew from every direction. Who would do this? How was it administered? How did he discover it? Dr. Chow calmly answered each question, and with each answer, I watched the color drain from Dashiell's face and Thorne's jaw tighten. Then I called in Marisol. She walked into that boardroom in her press dress, her head held high despite the fear I knew she was feeling. She was an undocumented housekeeper about to accuse two powerful men of attempted murder in front of corporate titans and federal agents. She had every reason to be terrified. But she looked at me, and I nodded, and she found her courage. Marisol told them everything she'd discovered. The vial in the sock drawer, the late-night conversation she'd overheard, her research into thallium poisoning. And then she pulled out her phone and played the recording. Dashiell's voice filled the boardroom. Cold, impatient, discussing my death like a business problem. She's not dying fast enough. The board is getting impatient. Thorne's response, smooth and calculated. One more dose should do it. Then it's ours. I've already prepared the transfer documents. Their discussion of how they'd frame my death as natural causes. Their plan to split my company's 60-40 and sell it within a year. The recording was damning, undeniable, and absolutely sickening. Board members physically recoiled. Someone gasped. The chairman's face went from confused to horrified to furious in the span of 30 seconds. Dashiell jumped to his feet, shouting that the recording was fake, that I was clearly mentally compromised and being manipulated. That Marisol was disgruntled and making wild accusations. That this was all some kind of elaborate misunderstanding. Thorne stayed seated, but his mind was clearly racing. He reached for his briefcase, probably planning to destroy or hide documents. But it was too late. Everything was already backed up, already in the hands of federal investigators, already part of a criminal case that was about to explode. I stood up from my wheelchair. It took effort, and my legs shook, but I stood. I looked at Dashiell, the man I'd loved for 15 years, and I spoke with a clarity I hadn't possessed in months. I told him I knew about everything. The gambling debts he'd hidden from me. The failed investments. The desperation that had driven him to plot my murder. I told him I knew he'd never loved me, that he'd only ever loved my money and my status and the power that came with being my husband. I told him that he'd been right about one thing. I had been too trusting. But I wasn't anymore. Then I turned to Thorne. I told him I knew about the embezzlement, about every dollar he'd stolen over 3 years while pretending to protect my interests. I told him I'd trusted him with everything because I thought he was my friend, and that betrayal hurt even more than Dashiell's because I'd never been sleeping next to him every night. I'd never made myself vulnerable to him the way I had with Dashiell. And yet he'd still decided I was worth more dead than alive. I told them both that they'd wanted my empire, that they'd calculated how to take it from me, how to erase me and claim everything I'd built. And then I said the words I'd been waiting days to deliver. You wanted my empire. You're getting a prison cell instead. The boardroom doors opened, and FBI agents entered. Agent Cross identified herself, announcing that Dashiell Hartwell and Thorne Ashford were under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, and forgery. She listed each charge clearly, and with each one, I watched my husband and my attorney realize that their entire plan had collapsed. That they hadn't just failed to kill me. They destroyed their own lives trying. Dashiell tried to run. He actually shoved past 2 board members and headed for the door. Federal agents tackled him before he made it 3 steps. He was yelling that I'd regret this, that he'd fight this, that I had no idea what I was doing. He was cuffed and dragged from the boardroom, still shouting threats that rang hollow against the evidence of his crimes. Thorne was quieter, but equally futile. He tried to argue that as an attorney he had certain protections, that there were proper procedures for this kind of accusation. Agent Cross informed him that attorney-client privilege doesn't extend to conspiracy to commit murder and that every document in his briefcase was now evidence in a federal investigation. When they cuffed him, his face finally cracked. The polished composure slipped, and for just a moment, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. Good. I wanted him afraid. I wanted both of them to feel a fraction of the fear I'd felt when I realized the people I loved most had been systematically poisoning me. The board sat in stunned silence as the FBI agents escorted Dashiell and Thorne from the building. When the door finally closed, the chairman turned to me and asked what I needed, what the company needed, how they could help. I told him the truth. That I needed time to recover fully, but that I was coming back stronger than ever. That Hartwell Quantum Securities was my life's work, and no one was taking it from me. That we'd weather this scandal and come out the other side better than before. And we did. Over the next 3 months, while Dashiell and Thorne sat in jail awaiting trial, I threw myself into recovery and rebuilding. The chelation therapy continued until every trace of thallium was purged from my system. My hair started growing back. My strength returned. My mind, sharp as ever once the poison was gone, reclaimed command of my company with a vengeance. The media had a field day with the scandal. Tech CEO poisoned by husband and lawyer in plot to steal billion-dollar company. The story was everywhere. And you know what happened? Our stock price soared. Investors saw a company that had survived a criminal conspiracy at its highest levels and emerged stronger. Clients saw a CEO who'd literally survived murder attempts and come back fighting. Our reputation for security and resilience, already strong, became legendary. We landed 3 major government contracts in the aftermath. Apparently, federal agencies appreciated doing business with someone who'd been investigated by the FBI and come out vindicated rather than indicted. The trial was quick and brutal. The evidence was overwhelming. The recording, the toxicology reports, the financial forensics that traced every stolen dollar, the forged documents. Dashiell and Thorne's attorneys tried everything, but there was no defense against the mountain of proof stacked against them. They were both convicted on every charge: attempted murder, conspiracy to commit fraud, embezzlement, forgery. The judge sentenced them each to 25 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole for the first 15. In her sentencing remarks, the judge said that the betrayal of trust at the heart of these crimes, the calculated cruelty of poisoning someone over months while pretending to love and support them, warranted the maximum penalty under the law. I attended the sentencing. I wanted to look them in the eyes one final time. Dashiell tried to catch my gaze, maybe hoping for some last-minute forgiveness or mercy. I stared through him like he was already gone. Thorne kept his eyes down, unable or unwilling to face what he'd become. As they were led away in chains, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction exactly, though that was certainly there. Not triumph, though I'd won so completely there was no other word for it. What I felt was freedom. Freedom from the weight of their betrayal, from the question of why, from the need for any kind of closure beyond watching justice be served. They were gone from my life. Forever. And I could finally move forward. 3 months after the trial ended, I was back in my office at full capacity. My hair had grown back thicker than before. My strength had returned completely. I'd even gained back the weight I'd lost, though I'd changed my relationship with food significantly. I prepared my own meals now, or ate at restaurants where I could watch my food being prepared. Trust, once shattered, doesn't fully return, but wisdom does. I'd called Marisol to my office for what I'd told her was a routine check-in. She arrived looking nervous, probably worried I was about to tell her something had changed, that I didn't need a housekeeper anymore now that my life had stabilized. She sat across from my desk, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes uncertain. I told her I had an announcement to make, that I'd been doing a lot of thinking about loyalty and courage and what those words really mean. That I'd built an empire on innovation and intelligence, but I'd almost lost it because I hadn't valued the right kind of wisdom. The wisdom that comes from really seeing people, from paying attention to what matters, from having the courage to act when action is terrifying. Then I slid a folder across my desk to her. Inside was a contract. A senior management contract appointing her vice president of operations for Hartwell Quantum Securities, with a salary that made her eyes go wide, full benefits, stock options, and a signing bonus that would change her life. Marisol stared at the documents like they were written in a language she didn't understand. She kept saying there must be some mistake, that she was just a housekeeper, that she didn't have the education or experience for this kind of position. I told her that she'd managed my household with more efficiency than most CEOs manage their companies. That she'd seen patterns and connections that eluded trained professionals. That she'd made decisions under pressure that saved not just my life, but the future of a multi-billion-dollar enterprise. That if she could do all that while being terrified of deportation and having every reason to stay silent, she could absolutely handle operations management.
She cried.
I cried. We sat in my office, 2 women who'd saved each other in different ways, and we cried together. But I wasn't done. I told her I'd also hired an immigration attorney, one of the best in the country. He'd worked on her case personally, expedited her citizenship application, and as of yesterday, Marisol Delgado was officially a United States citizen. She had her papers, her security, her future. And there was one more thing. Her granddaughter, the bright 7-year-old she'd brought to this country with such hope. I'd established a full scholarship fund for her education, preschool through PhD if she wanted it. And when the time came, She had a guaranteed spot at MIT with all expenses paid. The same school where I'd built the foundation of my empire, now open to the next generation of the Delgado family. Marisol couldn't speak. She just held my hands and cried harder, and I understood. These weren't tears of sadness or even just relief. They were tears of recognition, of being seen, of being valued, of having your courage acknowledged in ways that transform your entire world. Finally, she managed to whisper that she didn't know how to thank me, that I'd given her more than she could ever repay, that I'd changed everything for her family. I told her the truth, that she'd given me my life back, that she'd reminded me what loyalty actually looks like, that in a world where the people closest to me had proven to be my greatest enemies, she'd been the hero I didn't know I needed, that I didn't want her thanks. I wanted her partnership. I wanted her perspective in my boardroom, her wisdom in my strategy sessions, her courage in my company culture. She asked me what she'd said to her daughter Sophia all those years ago. If I really believed she could do this. If I really thought someone like her belonged in corporate leadership. I looked at this woman who'd risked everything to save me, who'd faced down powerful men with nothing but the truth and a recording on her phone, who'd refused to let fear silence her when a life was at stake. And I told her that if my company was going to build security systems for the most important institutions in the world, I needed someone who understood that true security isn't about technology or encryption. It's about people who pay attention, who care enough to act, who have the moral courage to do what's right even when it's terrifying. She was exactly the kind of person who belonged in leadership, and I was honored that she'd considered joining me. Marisol accepted the position. She's been my VP of operations for 6 months now, and she's extraordinary at it. She sees inefficiencies that others miss. She builds loyalty in our teams because she understands what real loyalty looks like. She asks questions that push us to be better, more thoughtful, more human in how we do business. She's not just an employee. She's family. The kind of family you choose, the kind that earns their place through actions rather than blood or marriage or legal contracts. So here's what I learned from almost being erased from my own life. Trust is precious, but it's not weakness. Kindness is powerful, but it's not naivety. Building something meaningful requires surrounding yourself with people who see you, really see you, not as an asset to be exploited, but as a human being worth saving. They thought my trust was weakness. They thought my kindness was naivety. They thought they could manipulate and murder and steal their way to an empire. But the strongest empires aren't built on power. They're built on the people who believe in you when you can't believe in yourself. They're built on the quiet courage of someone who cleans your home and notices when something's wrong. They're built on the kind of loyalty that risks everything to do what's right. Never underestimate the ones who see everything but say nothing. Sometimes the quietest voices are the ones that save your life. Sometimes the people you overlook are the heroes who refuse to let you be erased. Sometimes the woman who folds your laundry is the one who'll stand between you and death, not because she has to, but because love demands courage and courage transforms the world. I built a billion-dollar empire once from nothing. Then I survived having it almost stolen by the people I loved most. And now I'm building something even stronger. An empire that values wisdom over credentials. That recognizes courage wherever it appears. That understands true power comes from lifting up the people who see clearly in the dark. Dashiell and Thorn are in prison where they belong. My company is thriving beyond even my boldest projections. My health is fully restored. And every single day, I work alongside a woman who saved my life and now helps me build a legacy worth saving. They tried to poison me, steal from me, erase me. Instead, they freed me. They freed me from false love and fake friendship and the dangerous illusion that titles and relationships mean more than character. They freed me to build something real with someone real. And that's the greatest gift anyone's ever given me, even if they didn't mean to. If this story moved you, if it made you think about who really has your back and what loyalty actually means, then I've done what I set out to do. Drop a comment and tell me about someone who saw you when you felt invisible, who fought for you when you couldn't fight for yourself. Share this story with someone who needs to know that betrayal doesn't have to be the end. It can be the beginning of something stronger, truer, and more powerful than anything built on lies. And make sure you're subscribed because stories like this, stories about resilience and justice, and the people who refuse to let us disappear, these are the stories that need to be told. These are the stories that remind us what we're capable of when we refuse to be erased. My name is Celestine Hartwell. I built an empire, survived an assassination attempt, and reclaimed everything that was almost stolen from me. But more importantly, I learned that the most valuable thing I ever built wasn't a company. It was the kind of life where a woman like Marisol could see me drowning and dive in to save me without a second thought. That's power. That's legacy. That's what survives when everything else turns to poison.